Welcome to Talks at Google. Today we have a very special guest, Salman Rushdie. It's been over 25 years since the publishing of the Satanic Verses that made him a household name. But before that, he was already a fellow in the Royal Society of Literature. And in 2007, he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II. Not to mention that in 2001, he stole the spotlight in the film Bridget Jones' Diary. In his novel, Luca and the Fire of Life, there's a telling bit of dialogue that states, "You of all boys should know that man is the storytelling animal, and that stories are his identity, his meaning, his lifeblood. Do rats tell tales? Do porpoises have narrative purposes? Do elephants elephanticize? You know as well as I do that they do not. Man alone burns with books." With 12 novels and many works to his name, he has lived a life fully realizing these words. He truly knows what it means to have his stories be his identity, his meaning, and his lifeblood. In his new novel, 2 years, 8 months, and 28 nights, Salman goes beyond the traditional 1001 nights with a magical story spanning the centuries and brings a mythical struggle to America's doorstep. It is my pleasure today to introduce Salman Rushdie.
Thank you. Hi. So we were just talking before, and I was asked if it was true that in my earlier days I made my money writing advertising copy, and I did. And actually, one of the strangest things about the final season of Mad Men is that it basically caught up with the time when I was working in advertising, so it was horribly familiar. I mean, I remember I'd like to teach the world to sing, and I remember that suddenly made me think, oh, that's why they work in McCann Erickson, because that's where the Coke ad was made. And I have to say that it wasn't quite as alcoholic as the television series, but pretty close. And it wasn't completely as sexist as the television world, but also pretty close. I mean, I remember because I worked at Ogilvy and Mather for a long time, and on and off freelance, and when you work at Ogilvy's, on the first day there, you were given, I mean, this is a long time ago, but you were given a copy of the book by David Ogilvy about his advertising. It's called something like Confessions of an Advertising Writer. And just to give you a flavor of the time, the first sentence of the book says, "The consumer is not a moron, she is your wife." And that was very much I think you recognize that attitude from the television series. Anyway, I escaped that. In fact, when Midnight's Children came out in 1981 and started doing pretty well, I thought, finally, I can leave. And so I went to the creative director of the agency, and I said, I wrote this book and it's doing fine, and I wanted to be a writer, so I think I'm going to try and be a full-time writer, and so I quit. And he said, "Oh, you want a raise?" And I said, "No, really, I'm not, this isn't a negotiation. This is what I've always wanted to do, and now I'm going to go and do it." And he said, "Oh, you want a big raise?" And I tried to say to him that no, I said, "Look, it's just, I'm supposed to give you 30 days notice, so this is 30 days notice, and 31 days from now, I'm not going to be coming in the office." And he said, "Don't think we could give you as much as that." But then, to be fair to him, when the book actually did do very well, it won the Booker Prize and so on, we used to have these things called telegrams. The first telegram I got was from my very relieved bank manager. The second telegram was from him, the creative director, and it said, very sweetly, "One of us made it." Because of course, everybody who works in advertising has a TV sitcom in the bottom drawer, or a novel, or a play, or a movie script, or something. So yeah, that was my escape from advertising. But what it did teach me, and I think it's a lesson I've kept kept paying attention to. I mean, I think it taught me two things. One is it taught me to do the work like a job, not to think about inspiration, but just sit down every morning and do my day's work, and in a way not give myself permission not to do it. Because when you're working to deadlines, I mean, I guess journalists learn the same thing. When you're working to deadlines, you can't afford to have, creative tantrums. You've just got to get the work done on time, and it's got to be good. So that was a good lesson to learn, that lesson of professionalism, really. And the other thing, which is a strange thing to say for somebody who's written very, very long books sometimes. I mean, this book is, I'm happy to say, not that long. Finally, in my old age, learning to be brief. But I have written some long books, but advertising does teach you, in fact, not to waste words, because you don't have many words to waste. And I've always, again, taken that lesson into the writing of novels, because even if you write a long novel, I've always thought it has to feel like it needed to be that long, and it could have been much longer if you hadn't really been as concise as you could. The worst thing of all is to read a long novel that feels like it's going on forever. Then it's kind of close to unbearable. There's too many of those around. But anyway, so I think I did actually get quite a lot of useful information from that time. And I mean, I guess the other thing you think about a lot, and that I've thought about more and more as I've gone on, is exactly how readers read. It's very easy as a creative artist to think, well, I'm just doing my thing and I'll do it exactly as I want, and then it's up to the readers to find their way to it. And that, I mean, I think I've probably been guilty of that as well. But I've just become very interested in exactly how readers go about the business of reading, and what attracts them, and what repels them, and how you hold attention, and how you lose it. And one of the things that really helped me, I grew up in India, and one of the things about India is there still is a very rich oral tradition of storytelling. In some parts of India, particularly in South India, there are oral storytellers who still command very large audiences. I mean, like maybe 10 times the size of this audience, and they're immensely they're so popular, some of them, that they actually are recruited by politicians during election campaigns and things like that, and they can actually swing percentages of the vote. But the interesting thing about the oral story in India is that characteristically, it's not told as a linear story. It doesn't go beginning, middle, end. The famous advice given to the White Rabbit by the King of Hearts in the trial scene in Alice in Wonderland, when the White Rabbit is having trouble giving evidence. And the king says, start at the beginning, go on until you reach the end, and then stop. And there's a conventional wisdom that that's how you tell stories. But the oral story very remarkably doesn't do that at all. That when one of these storytellers stands up, he will usually start with an anecdote drawn out of mythology, out of the rich Indian mythological tradition. And he'll tell that for a bit, and then he will connect that to perhaps some political event of the time and try and show you the connections between that. And then he'll connect that to some personal anecdote of his own life, and then he'll sing a little song, and then he'll have some other digressions. And there's like 4 or 5 narrative lines that he's juggling at any given moment. And what is interesting is that instead of that being confusing to the audience, it's actually delightful. The audience enjoys the skill with which these storylines are interwoven, and just when you think it can't get any more complicated, he'll throw another ball in the air, and juggle these narrative balls, if you like. And I thought this is the exact opposite of what you're taught about how to write a story. And yet, here is this very, very ancient form, the oral narrative. And the oral storyteller knows exactly when he loses the attention of his reader, of his audience, because they get up and walk away. Or if you're really unlucky, they start throwing things at you. But anyway, it becomes very clear when they're not with you. And so everything about oral narration is designed to hold the audience's attention. That's its sole purpose. And interestingly then, that this playfulness, this multiple narration turns out to be a better way of holding people's attention than the conventional beginning, middle, end way. And so I thought that's really interesting. And what can I do with that? And I mean, one of the things this book has is really quite a lot of narrative lines that weave in and out of each other. And I think I sometimes think of it, and others of my books, as being, in a way, written down versions of that oral storytelling tradition, or at least that they've learned a great deal from that tradition. I mean, the other thing to say is that about growing up in India is that you're very lucky to grow up in a world of story. I mean, the incredible narrative traditions of India are a great gift to all of us who grow up there. I mean, first of all, of course, there are the great epics like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. But there are also all these traditions of what are called, collectively have got known as wonder tales, of which, the Arabian Nights, the 1001 Nights is the most famous, but there are many others. I mean, in India, there's a wonderful collection of animal fables, the Panchtantra. And what is great and very contemporary about those is that unlike European fables, unlike the kind of Aesop's fable tradition, they're not moralistic. Aesop's fables always end up with a neat little moral, like don't be greedy or be kind to people. But the Panchtantra fables aren't like that at all. In fact, they're very often deeply cynical, and the bad guys often win, and that makes them feel very modern. And then there are various compendiums of wonder tales, and even the Arabian Nights, so-called. Many of those stories actually originated in India. The journey of that book is very interesting. That it started out, almost certainly, most of the stories started out as Indian folk tales, and then at a certain point they were written down in Persian, in Farsi originally, because that was the court language at the time. And they moved west into the Persian-speaking, Farsi-speaking world. That was a book which was called Hazar Afsana, which means 1,000 stories. And that book has been completely lost. There's not a single copy of it survives. And the only reason we know of its existence is because it's referred to in other people's books. But we know of it that in that book already the famous story of Shahrazad telling stories to save her life is already present. And at a certain point it goes from Farsi into Arabic and becomes Alf Layla wa Layla, the 1,000 Nights and One Night. And on each of these steps of the journey, certain stories fall out and other stories are added, so that there isn't really a definitive text. The text changes as the book moves. And after the Arabic version moved around the Arabic-speaking world, it eventually found its way into Europe, initially into French, where it was translated into French by a man called Antoine Galland, who again dropped a few stories and added a few stories. And interestingly, some of the stories he added are the ones that you'll all know about. I mean, that's when Aladdin enters the Arabian Nights, and that's when Ali Baba enters the Arabian Nights. So oddly, these are actually not Eastern stories at all. They're kind of French. They think of Aladdin as a French person. And then eventually from French they made their way into English and so on. So it's a very interesting journey about how stories move across the world and inspire people in one culture after another and survive. In this case, I mean, probably these stories are, the earliest of them are probably 2,000 years old. And yet here we are still reading them and, having movies made out of them. I actually did meet one real genie. I did meet Robin Williams. And that was extraordinary because he never stopped, he was always on. And it was kind of extraordinary to just sit there and listen to this soliloquy. He actually told me I'll share with you the story he told me about playing the genie in the movie, which was originally supposed to be quite a small part. And so he was hired essentially as a day player to come in to do a day's recording, and went and did it, the bit that was written. And then he said to them, I think there's a bit more in this character, and can I just have a go? Can I just try a few things out? And they said, all right. And so he was there for a few hours, and he just went, and the improvisations were so brilliant that they actually had to reanimate the film in order to make the character much bigger. And he said then they got a little bit guilty because they hadn't really paid me very much money, because initially it was supposed to be quite a small role. He said, so they got guilty. And so he took me into his dining room, and he said, so they gave me this. And he pointed over the mantelpiece, and there was really quite a large, rather beautiful late period Picasso. So that's what he got for being blue. Anyway, so this book has genies in it, attacking Manhattan. And the last thing I want to say before I just read you a little bit of it and then we can talk, is that it comes out of not just an Eastern tradition of magic stories, but also a Western tradition for which I suppose the generic term is Surrealism. And I think I've been very affected as an artist, not just by literature, the literature of Surrealism, but actually by the visual arts of Surrealism, by the paintings of René Magritte, by the films of Luis Buñuel and Salvador Dali. And I think their influence is here somewhere in this book. And also what then developed out of Surrealism, which was what was called the theater of the absurd. Playwrights like Eugène Ionesco and Samuel Beckett. So I think that tradition, which to me is the kind of Western counterpart of the Eastern wonder tale, those two things are the things that came together in a way to give me the way that I've characteristically approached writing. And one of the things that really struck me about Surrealism is that one of the key ideas of the Surrealists was the idea that when we look at the world, we look at it through eyes that are dulled by habituation, because we're used to things. We look at things through habituated eyes. And they argued that formed a kind of, if you like, a sort of coating over our vision, which made us neglect to notice that the world is marvelous. And so the idea of Surrealism was that the idea of making it strange, the idea of scratching away that patina that dulls our vision so that we can again perceive the world as wonderful. And I think that's as good a reason for doing this kind of thing as any. So yeah, in this book there are these. The jinn is the collective term. The singular is jinni, which is where the word genie comes from. There's good ones and bad ones. Actually, one of the good ones is a jinni princess who falls in love with a human being. And there was this awful moment halfway through the book when I thought that I might be rewriting I Dream of Jeannie. And there was just a moment where you stop and think, really? Have I just done that by mistake? And I mean, I think you'll see if you read the book that the people involved, both supernatural and human, are really extremely unlike the characters in the sitcom. There's no harem pants, there's no nose wiggling. But there is, at the center of the book, a love affair between a fairy princess and a human being, so make of that what you will. But I wanted to read you a bit about the bad ones. What happens in the novel is that 4 very powerful, what are called dark jinn, manage to re-enter our world after a long absence, and they acquire world domination plans, which fortunately they're not that good at. The jinn suffer from all kinds of problems such as laziness and a kind of ADD. They can't keep their mind on anything for very long. But I thought I'd just read you, there's a bit, just since the classic thing about the genies is that you get them out of bottles, there actually is one moment in this novel where the most powerful of the jinn, who is a gigantic figure called Zamarad the Great, is rescued by one of the other characters who recurs in the book is this conservative Islamic philosopher called Al-Ghazali, who is anxious to impose a very doctrinaire, I guess what we might now call fundamentalist, although this is slightly earlier than that, vision on the world. And they kind of, the jinn and the philosopher sort of join forces. His adversary is a much more liberal philosopher known in the West as Averroes, but his Arab name is Ibn Rushd, which is actually obviously cognate with my surname. And that was interesting also. But I thought I'd just read you the bit about the bad guy, sort of villain of the novel. The Grand Ifrit, Zamarad Shah, on whose head was a golden crown, taken from the head of a prince he had accidentally, or not so accidentally, decapitated once upon a time, had at a certain point in history become the philosopher Ghazali's personal jinni, a terrifying entity whose name was too terrifying to utter. Ghazali was not, however, the jinni's master. The words master and servant are inappropriate when applied to the relationship between human beings and the jinn. For any service a jinni may perform for a human being is a boon rather than evidence of enslavement, an act of generosity, or, in the case of a jinni liberated from some sort of trap, a lamp, for example, a gesture of gratitude. The story goes that Ghazali had in fact freed Zamarad Shah from just such a trap, a blue bottle in which a forgotten sorcerer had trapped him. Long, long ago, wandering in the streets of his native city of Tus, Ghazali had spotted the opaque bottle lying abandoned in the heaps of trash, which unfortunately disfigured that old town of salmon minarets and enigmatic walls, and had intuited at once, as philosophers with the proper training are able to intuit, the presence of a captive spirit therein. He scooped up the bottle casually, but with the guilty expression of a novice burglar, and pressing his lips against the royal blue glass, whispered a little too loudly the occult incantation that is the required opening for all dialogues with captured jinn. Jinni great and jinni grand, now I hold you in my hand. Tell me, ere I set you free, what reward you'll offer me. A miniaturized jinni speaking through glass sounds like a talking mouse in a cartoon. Many human beings have been deceived by this feeble squeakity squeak into swallowing the poisoned pill the captive jinni will invariably offer them. Ghazali, however, was made of sterner stuff. This was the jinni's reply: never bargain, let me go. Weak men bargain. Strong men know those who freely set me free, evermore will blessed be. But Ghazali knew the proper retort to this childish deception. Well, I know your tribe and kin, make your promise while you're in. Without a sacred vow to keep, only fool lets jinni leap. Zamarad Shah, knowing that he had little choice, offered the usual 3 wishes formula. Ghazali replied, sealing the contract, accepting in words that deviated somewhat from the usual ones. Any time, 'neath any moon, I may ask you for a boon. Any time, these 1, 2, 3 swiftly will fulfill it be. Released, expanding at once to his full immensity, the jinni was struck by 2 things that marked out Ghazali as a most unusual mortal. Firstly, he did not quail. Quailing was not only de rigueur, it was also in most cases the instinctive reaction to the sight of Zamarad the Great in his dark glory. However, this mortal, the Grand Ifrit noted with some perplexity, quaileth not. And that was firstly. And secondly, he didn't ask for something right away. That was unprecedented. Infinite wealth, a bigger sexual organ, unlimited power. These wishes were at the top of any jinni's list of the top demands of the human male. The human male wishing mind was surprisingly unimaginative. But no wish, the deferral of all 3 wishes, that was almost indecent. You ask for nothing, Zamarad Shah roared, Nothing is a thing I cannot give. Ghazali inclined his philosopher's head and put a hand around his chin. I see that you give to nothing the quality of a thing. Nothing is the thing that cannot be given precisely because it is not a thing. Yet in your view, its not thingness is itself a form of thingness. This perhaps we may discuss. Understand, Ginny, that I am a man of few personal needs. I need neither infinite wealth, nor a bigger sexual organ, nor unlimited power. However, the time may come when I ask for some larger service. I'll let you know. In the meantime, be off, you're free to go. When will this time come? Zamarad Shah demanded. I'm going to be busy, you know. After being stuck in that bottle for so long, there are many things to be done. The time will come when it's time, Ghazali said infuriatingly, and turned away to his book. I spit upon all philosophers, Zamarad Shah told him, also artists and the rest of humanity as well. And he whirled himself into a funnel of rage and was gone. And then time passed, years passed, decades passed, and Ghazali was dead. And with him died the contract, or so the Jinni believed. And the slits between the worlds silted up and closed, and Zamarad in Paristan, which is fairyland, forgot for a time all about the world of men, all about the man who refused to make a wish. And centuries passed, and a new millennium began, and the seals which separated the worlds began to break. And then, boom, here he was again in the world of these feeble beings, and suddenly there was a voice in his head commanding his presence. The voice of a dead man, the voice of dust, of less than dust, the voice of the void in the grave where the dust of the dead man had been, a void that was somehow animated, somehow possessed of the sensibility of the dead man, a void that was ordering him to present itself to be told its first great wish. And he, having no option, being bound by the contract, even though he intended to argue that the contract did not apply posthumously, he remembered Ghazali's unusual language, any time neath any moon, any time, these 1, 2, 3, and he knew that as he had forgotten to insert a death clause, a detail he should make it a point to remember, if at any point in the future he needed to grant the 3 wishes contract again, the obligation still lay upon him like a shroud, and he had to do whatever the void desired. He remembered and summoned up in a rush all his unassuaged rage, the wrath of a grand Ifrit who has spent half an eternity bottled up in blue, and conceived the desire to be avenged against the entire species from which his captor came. He would rid himself of this puny obligation to a dead man, and then it would be time for vengeance. This he swore. I'll just finish that story by leaving out a bit. Yes, it's just how much he hates the human beings. He was the enemy of the human race because of his contempt for human character. It was as if he took the complexity of human beings as a personal affront, the maddening inconsistency of human beings, their contradictions, which they made no attempt to wipe out or reconcile, their mixture of idealism and greed, grandeur and pettiness, truth and lies. They were not to be taken seriously, any more than a cockroach deserves serious consideration. At best, they were toys, and he was as close as any of them would ever get to a wanton god, and he would, if he so chose, kill them for their sport. In other words, even if the philosopher Ghazali had not unleashed him upon the unsuspecting world, he would have unleashed himself upon it. His inclination was in accordance with his instructions, but the instructions from the dead philosopher were clear. Instill fear, Ghazali told him. Only fear will move sinful man towards God. Fear is a part of God in the sense that it is that feeble creature man's appropriate response to the infinite power and punitive nature of the Almighty. One may say that fear is the echo of God, and wherever that echo is heard, men fall to their knees and cry mercy. In some parts of the earth, God is already feared. Don't bother about those regions. Go where man's pride is swollen, where man believes himself to be godlike, lay waste his arsenals and fleshpots, his temples of technology, knowledge, and wealth. Go also to those sentimental locations where it is said that God is love, go and show them the truth. I don't have to agree with you about God, replied Zamarad Shah, about his nature or even his existence. That is not and never will be my business. In fairyland we do not speak of religion, and our daily life there is utterly alien to life on earth, and if I may say so, far superior. I can tell that even in death you are a censorious prude. So I will not go into details, although they are juicy. At any rate, philosophy is a subject of no interest except to bores, and theology is philosophy's more tedious cousin. I'll leave such soporific matters to you in your dusty grave. But as to your wish, I not only accept it as my command, it will be my pleasure to comply. With the proviso that as you are in fact asking for a series of acts, this will redeem the entirety of my 3 wishes pledge. Agreed, the void that was Ghazali replied. If the dead could giggle with delight, then the dead philosopher would have chortled with glee. The jinn perceived this. Why so mirthful, he inquired. Unleashing chaos upon the unsuspecting world is not a joke, or is it? Ghazali was thinking of his old rival, Ibn Rushd. My adversary in thought, he told Zamarad Shah, was a poor fool who was convinced that with the passage of time, human beings would turn from faith to reason, in spite of all the inadequacies of the rational mind. I obviously am of a different opinion. I have triumphed over him many times, yet the argument continues, and it is a fine thing, in a battle of wits, to be in possession of a secret weapon, an ace in the hole to play, a trump card to use at an opportune time. In this particular case, mighty Zamarad, you are that trump. I relish the fool's imminent discomfiture and his further inevitable defeat. Philosophers are children, the Jinni said, and I've never liked children myself. I'll stop there. But, I mean, it's a very odd book. After that, it gets really odd. So let me just stop there. And I mean, if you want to talk about, or we'll just sit here. Well, thank you. Oh, all right, we will just sit here. All right, somebody, yeah, good.
In the book, Geronimo goes back to India and laments about the differences between Bombay and Mumbai. I was wondering if you travel to India much now, and if you could talk about the differences now between now and your childhood.
No. Well, yes, I mean, I do go back fairly regularly. I mean, there's, as you know, as you perhaps know, there's this kind of joke in India about all of us who are NRIs, non-resident Indians, that come the winter, we all like homing pigeons, return and say, oh, here you are again, must be that season of the year. So yes, I do. And I mean, I think Bombay has, which I still persist in calling Bombay in the way that people in Saigon don't call it Ho Chi Minh City. It has changed. First of all, it's grown enormously. Secondly, of course, places do change over a period of time. But I think one of the ways in which it's changed that is saddening is that it used to be a city that prided itself on not having communal disputes. That Hindu-Muslim trouble, that kind of trouble between people of different traditions, kind of didn't happen there. Even at the time of the independence of India and Pakistan and the partition, when there were these great massacres, in Bombay essentially nothing happened, and people lived perfectly well alongside each other. And that was true all the time that I was growing up there, and it really went on until about the end of the 80s. It was like that, and then gradually what happened was the rise of a Hindu nationalism that was more aggressive than anything in the past, and the quality of the city began to change. And the proof of that was in 1993 when there were these series of terrorist explosions across the city, and that was, if you like, a kind of a moment of loss of innocence. And after that, and ever since then, the city has been the victim of communal discord like anywhere else. So the kind of exceptionalism of the city no longer exists, and that's a shame. But I mean, it's still my hometown. I'm still very fond of it. It's just a messier, slightly nastier place now. But everywhere is. so it's not alone. Anyone else?
Let me preface my question by saying that I'm sorry to say I have not read your books in the past. I'm hoping to remedy that soon.
Okay, good.
But
Well, if you get infected, you know, it's a long infection. There's a lot of books to read.
I'll start here and see where that takes me.
All right, go backwards.
Indeed. I was intrigued by your comment that you introduced your own name in a fashion as a character in this book, and I wondered whether in this book or in some of your previous books, if you have likewise introduced alter egos for real personages in your life.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the reason is my father, who was in part a scholar of Arabic and Farsi, was very interested in the philosophy of Ibn Rushd, and I mean, who in his time in the 12th century was a very progressive voice. So he was an Aristotelian philosopher, one of the great commentators on Aristotle, whose work enormously influenced afterwards Western philosophers like Thomas Aquinas and so on. But he was in his time a very progressive voice. He argued for the primacy of reason and logic and science against blind faith, and he came up against the kind of blind faith advocates of his time. And there actually was a moment in which he was exiled in disgrace and his books got burned, so I had that in common with him too, I discovered. Anyway, so for obvious reasons, I found him an attractive person, not just because of the name thing, because my father basically changed our family name to Rushdie because of his admiration for Ibn Rushd. And so that was obviously a first point of entry into finding out about him. But then I just became interested in him as him, you know, and because at the center of the book there's this ongoing argument between the rational and the irrational, you know, between the world of tolerance and the world of intolerance, between faith and unfaith, you know, that all those oppositions, which I mean may have taken a particular form right now, if you like, in the news, but it's an ancient opposition, you know, and I wanted to articulate that in some way, and he became a very useful character through which to approach that subject. So and I mean, again, I do know. I did obviously do the reading about the historical character, so I do know about him insofar as we know whatever we know about him, which is not his life has as is characteristic of something that's almost 900 years ago. There are gaps in the record, you know, but the things that are known about his life I do know, and so the character in the book is not incompatible with what is known about his life. But of course, I suspect he didn't have a love affair with the fairy princess. You know, that may be my invention. I leave it to you to decide. And I think, you know, I've always been, I mean, my training was as a historian, you know, so I've always, if you like, had two processes in my thought. You know, one is a historicist process, because one of the great questions of history is also one of the great questions of literature, which is what is the relationship between the individual and the world? You know, what are we simply the victims of history, or do we have the kind of agency that allows us to make history? You know, that question of the individual's relationship to society in general and to the events, the great events of his time. You know, that's something which, as a historian, you're always being asked to consider. You know, and history, as it developed in the 20th century, moved away from a kind of kings and battles idea of history to something more to something more social. You know, I mean, what was originally called the Marxist interpretation of history, which basically said that in order to understand history, you must look at the people. You must look at, you know, how ordinary life was lived and what moved the masses of the people and so on. And from that arises the political sphere of kings and battles. So anyway, I've always been interested in that, and of course, literature asks these questions all the time about how does the individual human being sit in the context of his time. And so, I mean, for me, I've often looked for stories in which individual human beings are at a kind of crossroads with great events. And I try and look at what they do to the events and what the events do to them. So that's one project in my mind, which is, if you like, naturalistic, historically based. And the other project is this kind of fairy tale thing. And it seems to me that the two are both very good ways of approaching the truth about human nature and who we are and what we do to each other. And quite often in my books, I've tried to put them both in. So what happens when you take both those kinds of discourse and allow them to collide with each other? What sparks does that throw off? So yeah, I mean, there have been, I think in quite a lot of my books, not all, but in a lot of them, there have been one or two historical figures here and there. I mean, not usually in leading roles. I haven't written the classic historical novel, in the way that Gore Vidal wrote about Lincoln or, Burr, and Lincoln actually. But history is always there. Or very, very frequently there in.
So I have I've been trying to figure out how to articulate the question, but you've had the misfortune of becoming a historical figure when the fatwa against you, and a victim of fundamentalism in a serious way. My understanding is that fundamentalism is a modern historical event.
Yes.
So,
well, in this form it is, yes.
So what I thought would be interesting to hear from you is, what do you see as the history, development of this sort of fundamentalism, and what do we do to...
About it?
Yes.
Well, I'm happy that you asked me to solve the most intractable problem. Because as it happens, of course, I have all the answers. If only people would ask me, it would all be fixed very fast. Well, first of all, there always has been, this argument between Ghazali and Ibn Rushd is a very important one, because, just to be clear, they didn't live in the same place or the same time. Ghazali lived hundreds of miles away in a different country and probably almost a century earlier. But Ghazali wrote a very famous book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers, in which he attacked the philosophy which was of the forebears of Ibn Rushd, were philosophers like Avicenna in the West, Ibn Sina, and Al-Farabi, one or two others, who were also people who advocated the use of reason and logic and science, as opposed to simply bowing down before the Almighty. And Ibn Rushd wrote a response to that, a book with the wonderful title of The Incoherence of the Incoherence, in which he argued, on behalf of reason and science and logic and against blind faith. But that argument, to an extent, has always been there in Islam. And as we now see, the literalists seem to have essentially won that argument. But in its modern form, this is, I don't know, it's certainly not more than half a century old. Certain amount of it has to do with the rise from Saudi Arabia of the Wahhabi cult, now sometimes also called Salafist, which the royal family, the Sauds, were followers of, and almost nobody else was, until they launched this enormous campaign to propagate Wahhabi Islam across the world by using the gigantic oil money, to set up schools and to send preachers around the world. And so now Wahhabi Islam has taken root all over the place and is the source of a lot of the trouble, because that's a very fanatical brand of Islam. And it's one of the reasons why I keep trying to persuade people that the Saudis are not our friends. So there are also different reasons in different places for the rise of extremism. In Afghanistan, you can say that the Taliban are kind of a reaction to and born out of the struggle against the Russian invasion. The so-called Mujahideen who fought against the Russians morphed into the Taliban after the Russians were expelled. In places like Algeria, what you had was a initially very popular and completely secular Marxist party of the revolution, which had expelled the colonial power and then taken over, and then over the years became fat, became complacent and rich and corrupt. And people swung away from that towards the religious extremists as a reaction. So it's not the same thing everywhere. You know, it's a phenomenon that's developed a lot of momentum, but actually arose from local roots in local places. And I mean, as to the cure, I think I'll have to admit to not having one. But one of the things I think that we can notice is that in those countries in which fanatical extremist Islam has gained the most power, those are also the countries in which it's most disliked. So that, you know, the people of Afghanistan were not fans of the Taliban. The people of Iran, to a very large extent, feel oppressed by the rule of the Ayatollahs, and so on. You know, in Algeria, the radical Islamic groups, the FIS and GIA, took power, but were very rapidly disliked, and, you know, and fell from power. So maybe, if you take a kind of long historical view, that this is a thing that is burning through the Muslim world. I mean, ISIS is something else again, because that's something that hasn't happened before. There's never been an army before, you know, and this army, which is recruiting from all over the world, and which seems to have a lot of funds at its disposal, partly from, I don't know, I mean, partly, we don't know which governments are giving money to ISIS, but you could have a pretty good bet in the nature, in the direction of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and Qatar. But they also have seized oil wells, and they're selling oil on the black market and so on. So they're suddenly very well funded, and they're getting recruits from all over the world, which that's a new phenomenon, which is in a way harder to defeat. The other thing, I think you could argue that the other thing would burn itself out, because people would rapidly become disenchanted. But what's happened in Iraq is you have a failed state, and in that lawless place, this new entity can present itself as the law. I mean, by brute force can present itself as the law, and that's going to be very difficult to defeat. You know, so, and I sort of doubt that it can be defeated by airstrikes alone. So yeah, I'll stop there, which is not the place you want me to stop, but I don't have the cure. So that's what I can say right now.
To shift from solving the world's problems to your writing,
Yeah.
you play with all sorts of ideas. You mentioned that you were worried that you were slipping into I Dream of Jeannie.
Slipping
Why not
what, sorry?
into I Dream of Jeannie?
Oh, yeah.
Why shouldn't an astronaut fall into the middle of your narrative?
Well, there ain't no astronauts in here. Larry Hagman is not present. And there's no harem pants either. Although there is at the point at which I realized that there was this echo, I decided to make it conscious. And so there actually is a moment in the book where you'll see a conscious, direct reference to that particular thing. I'll leave it to you to discover it. But I thought, you know, if you realize you're doing it, you may as well let people know that you know, rather than have somebody tell you as if you didn't know. No, look, I mean, the book is, I mean, I'm very interested in popular culture. I always have been, and I kind of don't make a distinction, really, between high and low culture. Because I think the thing about being a novelist is you have to be very interested in life as it's actually lived. You have to know what's really in people's heads. What are people really thinking about, and how are they talking, and so on. So you need to know, you know, what is the rubbish in people's heads, otherwise you can't make them talk properly. And so I think, you know, this is something I take from writers like Dickens. If you think about Dickens, his novels go into every part of society. You know, they go into the slums and the criminal areas and the debtors' prisons, but they also go into, you know, high society and so on. And he himself, I think, set out to know London in particular, but not only London, as profoundly as he could, to get into as many rooms and into as many interesting places as he could, so that afterwards he had that at his disposal, to write about. And I think that's exactly what a writer should do. You should try and learn the world, learn what people's lives are like in places which are completely not like the place where you spend your time, and learn what they think about. What do they watch? What do they talk about? What is the slang of different generations? I mean, all of that stuff. I think to be a novelist, you have to engage with that. And so, you'll find all kinds of references to popular culture scattered through this book, as well as the egghead stuff. But I think that's fine. I think, that's... once upon a time, writers could expect from readers that readers would have quite a wide knowledge of, for example, Greek and Roman mythology, that you could refer to, you could refer to the shirt of Nessus, and your readers would know what you were talking about, that you were talking about this poisoned shirt that was given to Hercules by the widow of somebody that he killed, and when he puts on the shirt begins to attack him and eat him. And you could assume that your readers would have a general knowledge of that kind of mythology. Now, they don't, right? So, but there is a popular mythology which is based on things like music and television and people whose names begin with K. And you may as well be aware of that too, because it becomes a way of making references that people will grasp. So yeah, I dream of Jeannie as well.
So back to the world's problems, but I won't ask you to solve them.
Yeah.
So like something I noticed recently, I started reading little bits of more ancient literature, like Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus, like Stoic philosophers. And it's I was really struck by, this, a lot of this really applies, about the mind versus one's circumstances and things like that. And it seems like a lot of these issues still apply today. And even just reading about Roman history, it's a lot of the same issues. We live in much better circumstances, I think, than during the Roman Empire. Life is a lot easier, at least here, and a lot of places in the world. So it seems like the trends are generally good, over kind of centuries or millennia, but also in some ways the stakes are higher, the risks are higher. Technology is a huge catalyst for destructive capabilities as well as kind of hopefulness for mankind, right? Nuclear weapons, obviously, a devastating form. So, with my very kind of simplistic view of these things, on the one hand, things seem to be trending well for mankind as a whole, but also there's some greater risks which do seem unique to our times and potentially the genie's out of the bottle. Right? And it's these things can't go back in. How do you think about these things?
Well, I mean, I agree with most of what you've said, and I mean, clearly there's a way of writing about the modern world which would be very dystopic. You could argue that the world is in bad shape and it's going to get worse and probably will end badly. And it would have been easy to write this book like that. But for that reason, I didn't want to do it, because again, one of the things that you do learn, which is very useful to know from the study of history, is that history is not set on tramlines. It is not inevitable. It's not determinist. It very often, almost always, frankly, does not go in the direction you think it's going to go. That there are strange left turns and night's moves and unexpected developments, which, for better or worse, it can be either way. So it's a very good idea not to see the future as inevitable or set, because it isn't. I mean, put it like this: if in January of 1989, I had told you guys that the Soviet Union would not exist by Christmas, you would probably have thought I was crazy, because it seemed crazy to say such a thing, and yet within a very few months, actually within a very few weeks, it just blew away. I mean, the fact that there's somebody trying to put it back together now is another story. But that's what I'm saying, that there can be gigantic changes in world conditions at very, very high speed. Especially, I feel that we live in a very accelerated time, in which the rate of change is probably greater than it's ever been in human history. I mean, I'm just thinking that, within my memory, the gesture for a telephone has changed 3 times. You know, when you used to say, call me, you would make a dialing gesture. Then when phones became a bit modern, you would make a pushing buttons gesture. And now you do that. So just if you look at something like the telephone, the rate of transformation has been great. I mean, there's also, you remember fax machines? I mean, I remember when fax machines arrived and somebody said to me, you should have a fax machine. I thought, why should I have one? Because nobody else I know has one, so there's nobody to fax, And then suddenly everybody had one, and now once again, nobody has one. So when you live in a world that's changing like that, it can go anywhere, really. And I don't think anybody can foretell how it'll go. So I wanted to suggest in the book that the book I'm not going to tell you what happens at the end, but it ends in a future which maybe at the moment we don't have any right to believe might happen. That doesn't mean it won't. I just wanted to invent something else other than the inevitable. Because in my view, futurology has become a big thing now. People try to predict directions, and my view is that futurology is the science of being wrong about the future. Because if you think about the film 2001: A Space Odyssey. Look at how people dress in that film. They all wear kind of Pierre Cardin jumpsuits, and that's not what's happening. It's no matter how brilliantly you foresee the future, you're really talking, all science fiction that talks about the future is really talking about the present. 1984 was really talking about 1948. And the only reason he called it 1984 is because it's the last 2 digits reversed. So this literature of the future is usually uses the future as a way to make an allegory or a myth about the present day. And so it's better to say, okay, we don't know what's coming, but let's not assume the worst. Let's not assume the best either. Let's not be stupid. But the worst is not inevitable. And I just wanted to have that thought in the book.
Hi, I first of all want to say thank you so much for being here. It's been an honor hearing you speak. I've been a fan of yours for a long time. Actually, I first picked up Haroun in the Sea of Stories when I was about 11, and my mind was opened. I loved it so much. I thought, hey, let's see what else this author has written. Picked up the Satanic Verses and had a slightly different experience at age 12.
Yeah, that may not be the age.
No, might not have been quite aimed at me. But actually, that's part of my question is you do have a few books that are aimed towards younger readers. And I'm wondering what sort of considerations do you have when writing a book for children than for adults?
Well, first of all, they're not for little children. They're kind of young adult books. They're aimed at sort of 11, 12. These days, of course, kids grow up younger. So 11, 12-year-olds now, they're kind of 18. And they were written, basically 2 of them were written, one each for my 2 sons. But I think, kids now the children's literature takes on very rough themes. There's a lot of young adult books which deal with, violence and child abuse and drugs and etc. And kids seem to be able to deal with that. So I think kids are much more able to deal with stuff than we think sometimes. These books they're not like that. They're more in a way, this book is like Haroun for grown-ups. So it's in the same neck of the woods. The great writer E.B. White, who wrote Charlotte's Web and so on. He famously said, "You don't write down to children; you write up." And it's true that children are very, very tough readers. If they don't like a book, they do not finish the book. Sometimes they put it down quite roughly. There's that great line of Dorothy Parker's when she didn't like a book. She said, "This book should not be put down; it should be thrown across the room with great force." and children will do that. Children will write to you and tell you what they like, but they'll also write and tell you what they don't like. One of the great pleasures of writing Haroun was that I would get these bundles of letters where an entire classroom somewhere had read the book, and they would send me drawings of the characters and tips for sequels. and you know, which characters they liked best and which ones they didn't, and so on. And it was just the most wonderful reader response. You know. The only thing, I mean, I think the only question that is different from writing for adults is there are issues of vocabulary, you know, where sometimes you'll use a simpler word instead of a more complicated word. But on the other hand, kids like complicated words. You know, they like to sort of walk around saying like 4-syllable words because it makes them feel good. And sometimes I would shorten a sentence, you know, cut a sentence in half instead of have 2 short sentences and 1 long one. But really, just writing. Really, in the end, it didn't require that much of a change of gear. Because the form of the fable, which I guess is what Haroun is notable because the fable classically uses very simple language to say things which are not simple, you know, and that's what makes it a beautiful vehicle. And so again, you know, if you're writing in that vein, the point is to write a simple story that ends up not being simple. You know, so in that sense, you don't have to worry too much about issues of language or form, because the form itself dictates that kind of simplicity. So yeah, it was fun to do. I've done 2. I mean, if I had a 3rd child, I'd do 3. But I might have to find somebody else's child to do one for. I mean, I'm a great believer in the rule of 3, and I've only done 2. And one of the things, because I never had a daughter, both of those are kind of books about boys. And I'd quite like to do one in which the main character was female rather than male. You know, so maybe that'll show up at some point. Okay, I think we have to stop. Thank you very much. Thank you.